The air in rural Pennsylvania has a way of swallowing sound, especially when you're standing in the middle of a 60-acre gravel parking lot at 2 in the morning. I remember the weight of my keys in my hand as I approached the Blackwood Creek logistics hub for my first shift. It was a massive, windowless slab of gray concrete and corrugated steel that looked more like a tomb than a warehouse. I was 24, broke, and desperate enough to drive an hour out of Philadelphia for a paycheck that seemed too high for a job that required no experience. My supervisor, Mr. Henderson, was waiting for me at the heavy security gate. Mr. Henderson was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of dry wood, gaunt, pale, and possessed of a nervous twitch in his left eyelid that never seemed to quit. Mr. Henderson didn't offer a handshake. He just handed me a plastic lanyard and gestured for me to follow him into the belly of the facility. The interior of Blackwood Creek was a labyrinth of towering steel shelves that reached so high into the darkness they seemed to support the ceiling itself. It was freezing inside, a dry, artificial cold that made the hair on my arms stand up. Mr. Henderson led me to a central glass booth elevated 10 feet off the ground, overlooking the main sorting floor. Inside the booth were 42 flickering monitors, each one a window into a different desolate aisle of the warehouse. Mr. Henderson sat me down and pointed to a large red reset button on the console. He leaned in close, and I could smell the stale coffee and peppermint on his breath as he gave me the only rule that mattered. Mr. Henderson told me that if I saw a wooden crate labeled Department 0 on any conveyor belt, I was to close my eyes immediately, press the reset button, and wait until I heard the mechanical hum of the belt resume. Mr. Henderson warned me that under no circumstances was I to look at the monitors while that specific crate was in motion. Then, without another word, Mr. Henderson walked out of the booth, his footsteps echoing against the concrete until they were swallowed by the silence. For the first 3 hours, the job was mind-numbing. I watched the automated robots, orange rectangular machines, glide silently across the floor, picking up standard cardboard boxes and moving them to the loading docks. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't a natural quiet, but a heavy, pressurized stillness that made my ears ring. Around 3:12 a.m., the temperature in the booth dropped so sharply I could see my own breath misting in the air. I looked at monitor 14, which covered the north loading bay. A crate was emerging from the shadows of aisle 47. It wasn't cardboard. It was old, dark wood, bound in rusted iron straps that looked like they had been pulled from a shipwreck. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw the faded white stencil on the side, Department 0. I remembered Mr. Henderson's warning. I reached for the red button, but my hand froze. Something was wrong with the movement of the crate. It wasn't being carried by an orange robot. The crate was being dragged by something tall and spindly, something that moved with a sickening, jerky rhythm, like a spider with broken legs. I told myself it was just a glitch in the frame rate, a trick of the low-light cameras. I didn't close my eyes. Instead, I grabbed the joystick and zoomed in on monitor 14. The figure dragging the Department 0 crate was wearing a rusted metal harness that dug into its gray, translucent skin. It had no face, just a smooth, tight surface where eyes and a nose should have been, and a jagged vertical slit for a mouth. As I watched, the creature stopped. It didn't have ears, but it seemed to hear the hum of the camera's zoom motor. It slowly turned its head toward the lens, and the vertical slit on its face began to stretch open, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth that looked like yellowed bone. Panic surged through me, a cold wave that turned my blood to slush. I slammed my hand down on the red reset button. The monitors went black, but the silence didn't return. Instead, the intercom system in my booth crackled to life. I expected to hear Mr. Henderson's voice, perhaps scolding me for my curiosity, but the voice that came through the speakers was wet and distorted, a sound like boots stepping through deep mud. It whispered my name, Marcus, with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. I sat paralyzed in the dark booth, the only light coming from the tiny LED on the reset button. Then I heard it, a rhythmic metallic scraping coming from directly beneath the floorboards of my booth. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud. Something was climbing the steel ladder. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone the beam toward the glass door. Outside, in the darkness of the warehouse, I saw dozens of them. The pale, harness-clad figures were emerging from the shadows of the high shelves, their elongated limbs clicking against the concrete. They weren't interested in the crates anymore. They were all looking up at the glass booth. They were looking at Marcus. I realized then why the pay was so high and why Mr. Henderson looked so haunted. This wasn't a logistics hub, it was a feeding ground. The Department Zero crates weren't containing goods, they were empty, waiting to be filled. I heard the glass door of the booth creak, a long gray finger with a jagged black nail hooked around the edge of the frame. I backed away until my spine hit the monitors, the cold glass biting into my shirt. The vertical slit on the creature's face opened wide, and as it stepped into the light of my flashlight, I didn't see a monster. I saw Mr. Henderson's reflection in the creature's smooth, wet skin, and I realized that at Blackwood Creek, you don't just work the night shift, you become the night shift.
The wind doesn't just howl when you're suspended 500 feet above the pavement of downtown Chicago. It screams, a high-pitched metallic whistle that vibrates through the very steel of the scaffolding. My name is Elias, and I spent 6 years thinking I was untouchable because I knew how to dance with gravity. But that was before I took the contract at the Sovereign Tower. The Sovereign is a jagged needle of black glass and chrome that pierces the low-hanging clouds of the Great Lakes, a building so tall it creates its own weather patterns. On my first morning, I met my partner, a veteran climber named Sully, who had skin like weathered leather and eyes that never seemed to focus on anything closer than the horizon. Sully didn't care about my experience or my safety certifications. He only cared about one thing. As we stepped onto the motorized platform, Sully grabbed my shoulder with a grip that bruised and told me that when we reached the 44th floor, I was to keep my eyes fixed on the bucket of soapy water and never, under any circumstances, look through the glass. Sully said the 44th floor was dead space, a mechanical floor that didn't exist on the building's elevator directory, and that the things inside weren't meant for human eyes. The climb up the side of the Sovereign Tower took nearly 10 minutes, the city noise of Chicago fading into a dull, distant hum, until all I could hear was the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the hoist cables. Sully worked with a mechanical precision, his squeegee hiss slapping against the glass in a hypnotic tempo. We passed the 35th floor, then the 40th, the wind picking up speed until the entire platform began to sway like a pendulum. As we approached the 44th floor, the sunlight seemed to die, swallowed by a strange, oily film on the windows that shouldn't have been there. Sully went silent, his head bowed, his eyes locked onto his own boots. I tried to do the same, focusing on the swirling white foam in my bucket, but then I heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist 500 feet in the air. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass, like a child's fingernails clicking against a window pane. I told myself it was just the wind whipping a loose cable, but the tapping followed the movement of our platform, perfectly synchronized with my own breathing. Curiosity is a poison that works slowly until it paralyzes you. Despite Sully's warning, my eyes drifted toward the dark glass of the 44th floor. At first, I saw nothing but my own reflection, Elias, pale and wide-eyed, framed against the gray Chicago sky. But as a flash of lightning illuminated the interior, the reflection didn't match. Inside that empty mechanical floor was a perfect, terrifying replica of my grandmother's kitchen in South Boston, right down to the chipped yellow paint on the walls and the smell of burnt toast that somehow seeped through the airtight seal of the skyscraper. Standing by the stove was a woman who looked exactly like my mother, but her proportions were wrong. Her arms were too long, her elbows bending in directions that defied anatomy, and where her face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless mask of skin. Sully must have sensed my shift in posture, because he hissed my name, "Elias, don't you dare!" But it was too late. The woman in the kitchen turned toward the window, her elongated fingers reaching out to touch the glass right where my heart was beating on the other side. The tapping sound intensified, becoming a frantic, wet scratching. Then the reflection of Elias in the glass began to change. My reflection started to scream, but no sound came out, and blood began to leak from its eyes. I watched in horror as the mother figure inside the room leaned down and whispered something into the ear of my reflection. Suddenly, the motorized hoist groaned, and the left cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The platform tilted violently, sending my bucket of water plummeting into the abyss below. I scrambled to grab the guardrail, my boots slipping on the wet metal, while Sully screamed at me to hook my safety line to the emergency backup. But as I looked at Sully, I realized with a jolt of pure terror that he wasn't looking at me. He was looking through the glass, his face twisted into a mask of recognition and grief. Sully whispered a name, Mary, and reached out his hand to touch the window. The glass of the Sovereign Tower didn't shatter, it softened, turning into a dark gelatinous liquid that began to pull Sully into the building. I lunged for him, grabbing his belt, but the force pulling him was immense, an unnatural suction that smelled of old ozone and decay. Sully looked at me one last time, his eyes finally focusing, and told me to cut the line. He said if I didn't, the 44th floor would take us both to fill the dead space. I pulled my utility knife and hacked at the nylon webbing of Sully's harness just as the glass began to ripple toward my own feet. With a final sickening schlick, Sully disappeared into the dark interior of the Sovereign Tower, and the glass instantly solidified, turning back into a cold, black mirror. I was left dangling from a single cable, swaying in the Chicago storm, staring at a window that now showed nothing but an empty, concrete rooms filled with dust. When the emergency crew finally hauled me up 2 hours later, they told me that Sully had never been on the manifest for that shift, that I had gone up the tower alone. But every night since, when I look into the mirror to brush my teeth, I don't see Elias anymore. I see the 44th floor, and I see Sully standing in that yellow kitchen, holding a squeegee and waiting for me to come back to work. The silence of the Willamette National Forest in Oregon isn't peaceful. It is heavy, a suffocating blanket of pine needles and ancient shadows that seems to watch you back. My name is Sarah, and after my life in Portland fell apart, I thought taking a seasonal job as a fire lookout in Tower 9 would be the perfect way to disappear into the clouds. Tower 9 is a small, glass-walled box perched on stilts 60 feet above the forest floor, accessible only by a steep, rusting iron staircase that groans with every step. When I arrived, the ranger who dropped me off, a man named Miller with eyes as cold as a mountain stream, handed me a heavy transistor radio and a logbook with yellowed pages. Miller told me that my only job was to watch for smoke, but he added a warning that made the back of my neck prickle. If the radio ever began to broadcast my own voice back to me, I was to lock the trap door, turn off all the lights, and stay perfectly still until sunrise. Miller didn't explain why, and before I could ask, he had disappeared back into the tree line, leaving Sarah alone with nothing but the wind and the trees. For the first week, Sarah found a strange rhythm in the isolation, marking the passage of time by the shifting light on the Cascades. But on the 8th night, the wind changed, carrying a scent that shouldn't have been there, the smell of wet fur and ozone, sharp and electric. I was sitting at the map table when the radio crackled to life, the static sounding like 1,000 dead leaves skittering across a sidewalk. A voice came through, clear and familiar, calling out, "Sarah, are you there? It's getting so cold down here." It was the voice of my mother, who had been buried in a cemetery 3,000 miles away for 5 years. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I gripped the microphone, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to scream, to answer, but I remembered Miller's blank stare and stayed silent, my breath hitching in my throat as the mother voice began to describe exactly what Sarah was wearing: the frayed blue sweater, the silver locket, even the way I was biting my lower lip. The psychological weight of the silence became a physical pressure in the room. I looked out the windows, but the glass had turned into a black mirror, reflecting only Sarah and the flickering orange glow of the kerosene lamp. Suddenly, the radio emitted a high-pitched squeal that made my ears bleed, and then a new voice began to speak, my own voice. It wasn't a recording, it was a live narration of my every movement. Sarah is standing up now. Sarah is walking toward the north window. Sarah is wondering if the creature at the bottom of the stairs can see her. I froze, my blood turning to ice water. I slowly turned my head toward the trap door in the center of the floor. Thump, thump, thump. Something was hitting the underside of the wood, a heavy, wet sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Sarah's feet. I lunged for the lock, sliding the heavy iron bolt just as the trap door buckled upward, a pale, multi-jointed finger with a black hooked claw sliding through the gap. The radio in Sarah's hand began to laugh, a distorted, overlapping sound of 100 Sarahs laughing in unison. "Sarah thinks she's safe," the voices chanted. "Sarah doesn't realize that Tower 9 isn't a lookout, it's a cage." I backed away toward the glass, the cold Oregon wind howling outside, and realized that the shadows in the trees below weren't trees at all. They were standing still, hundreds of tall, elongated figures with reflective eyes, all staring up at Sarah's glass box. The creature beneath the floor stopped thumping and began to speak through the wood, using Miller's voice, telling Sarah that the sun wasn't going to rise tomorrow because the forest had decided it was time to eat. I sat in the center of the room, the radio still whispering my darkest secrets in my own voice, while the glass began to crack under the pressure of 1,000 invisible hands. As the first pane of glass shattered, spraying Sarah with shards of cold moonlight, I realized that Miller had never left the forest. He was part of the choir now. The last thing I heard before the lights went out for good was the radio telling me that Sarah was finally home. Now, when the new lookouts come to Tower 9 and hear a woman's voice on the radio, they think it's just the wind, but I know it's just me waiting for the next person to take the job. New Orleans in July doesn't just feel hot, it feels alive, a thick, wet heat that smells of swamp water, jasmine, and old rot pressing against your skin like a damp wool blanket. My name is Jax, and I was desperate enough for a paycheck that I didn't ask questions when I saw the flyer for stigmatized property specialists taped to a cracked window in the French Quarter. The job was simple: deep clean houses where people had died alone, houses that the city wanted to forget. My boss was a woman named Mrs. Dubois, a sharp-featured lady who wore black silk even in the humidity and smelled of expensive perfume and funeral lilies. On my first day, Mrs. Dubois drove me to a crumbling mansion on Burgundy Street, its white paint peeling like dead skin, and handed me a bucket of industrial bleach and a heavy-duty respirator. Mrs. Dubois looked me dead in the eye and gave me one rule that chilled me more than the morgue-like interior of the house. No matter how much blood you find, no matter how deep the stains go, do not use salt and do not bring a drop of holy water inside these walls. Mrs. Dubois claimed it interfered with the chemical cleaners, but her hand trembled as she locked the front door behind Jax, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the foyer. The house was a tomb of forgotten things, the air so thick with dust that my flashlight beam looked like a solid pillar of white light. Jack started in the master bathroom, where the previous owner had supposedly slipped, though the amount of dark, copper-smelling fluid crusted onto the clawfoot tub suggested something much more violent. As Jack scrubbed, the rhythmic shuck-shuck of the brush against the porcelain was the only sound, until I heard a faint, wet sliding noise coming from behind the massive gold-framed vanity mirror. I pushed on the frame, and the mirror swung open on rusted hinges, revealing a narrow, dark crawl space that wasn't on the floor plan. My heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I crawled inside, the smell of ozone and wet earth filling my lungs. Jax shone the light on the back wall and found thousands of Polaroid photos pinned to the rotting wood, each one dated and labeled in neat, cramped handwriting. My breath hitched as Jax realized every single photo was of me. There was Jax sleeping in a studio apartment in Austin 3 years ago, Jax at a gas station in rural Mississippi, Jax walking into the interview with Mrs. Dubois yesterday. The realization that Jax hadn't found this job, the job had found Jax, turned my blood to ice. Suddenly, the bathroom door slammed shut and the mirror swung closed, locking Jax in the darkness of the crawlspace. I heard the heavy, slow footsteps of Mrs. Dubois approaching the other side of the wall, but her voice had changed. It was no longer elegant, but a low, guttural rasp that sounded like dry leaves being crushed. Mrs. Dubois whispered through the wood, "The house doesn't want the stains gone, Jax. The house just wants fresh ink for the pictures." Jax scrambled backwards, my hands hitting something cold and soft in the corner of the crawl space, a pile of clothes that looked exactly like the ones Jax was wearing, but they were shredded and soaked in that same metallic-smelling fluid. From the other side of the mirror, I heard the sound of a camera shutter click, snap, whir, and a fresh Polaroid slid through the gap beneath the mirror frame, landing face up in the dirt next to my hand. Mrs. Dubois began to hum a distorted lullaby, and the walls of the crawlspace started to contract, the rotting wood groaning as it squeezed closer to Jax's chest. I realized then that the stigmatized properties weren't crime scenes, they were traps, and Jax was just the latest soul brought in to keep the history of the house alive. Now, when people walk past that mansion on Burgundy Street, they don't see the stains, but if they look closely at the windows, they might see Jax looking back, waiting for the next specialist to arrive with a bucket and a brush.
अगली सुबह जब सूर्य की पहली किरणें वन की उस छोटी सी कुटिया पर पड़ी, तो वहां का दृश्य पूरी तरह बदल चुका था। राजा द्युम्नसेन अब अपनी दिव्य दृष्टि से प्रकृति की सुंदरता को निहार रहे थे और उनके चेहरे पर राजाओं जैसा ओज वापस लौट आया था। यमराज के वरदान का प्रभाव इतना तीव्र था कि वन के पशु पक्षी भी सावित्री और सत्यवान की कुटिया के चारों ओर एकत्रित होकर आनंद मना रहे थे। तभी वन के मार्ग से धूल का एक विशाल गुबार उठता हुआ दिखाई दिया। जब वो निकट आया तो सबने देखा कि साल देश के मंत्री, सेनापति और हजारों सैनिक स्वर्ण रथों के साथ वहां पहुंच चुके थे। सेनापति ने रथ से उतरकर राजा द्युम्नसेन के चरणों में अपनी तलवार रखी और ऊंचे स्वर में घोषणा की, हे महाराज द्युम्नसेन, आपकी प्रजा ने उस अत्याचारी राजा को सत्ता से उखाड़ फेंका है जिसने आपका राज्य छीना था। पूरा साल देश अपने न्यायप्रिय राजा द्युम्नसेन और राजकुमार सत्यवान की प्रतीक्षा कर रहा है। कृपा कर आप सपरिवार महल की ओर प्रस्थान करें। राजा द्युम्नसेन ने अपनी पत्नी और पुत्र सत्यवान की ओर देखा, जिनकी आंखों में खुशी के आंसू थे। सावित्री ने मुस्कुराते हुए अपने ससुर राजा द्युम्नसेन से कहा, पिताजी, ये काल का चक्र है जो अब आपके पक्ष में घूम चुका है। अब धर्म की स्थापना का समय आ गया है। पूरा परिवार भव्य रथों पर सवार होकर अपने राज्य की राजधानी पहुंचा। नगर की सड़कों पर फूलों की वर्षा हो रही थी और प्रजा सती सावित्री की जय और राजकुमार सत्यवान चिरंजीवी हो के नारे लगा रही थी। एक भव्य समारोह में राजा द्युम्नसेन का पुनः राज्याभिषेक हुआ और साथ ही सत्यवान को युवराज घोषित किया गया। सावित्री, जो कल तक वन में फटे वस्त्रों में लकड़ियां चुन रही थी, आज साल देश की कुलवधू के रूप में सिंहासन पर विराजमान थी। लेकिन सावित्री के मन में कोई अहंकार नहीं था। वो आज भी उतनी ही विनम्र थी जितनी वो वन की कुटिया में थी। कुछ समय पश्चात सावित्री को एक और शुभ समाचार प्राप्त हुआ। राजा अश्वपति के दूत ने आकर बताया कि राजा यमराज के वरदान स्वरूप राजा अश्वपति के महल में 100 पुत्रों का जन्म हुआ है, जिससे उनका वंश अब अमर हो गया है। सावित्री ने एकांत में जाकर भगवान को धन्यवाद दिया और अपनी कुल देवी की पूजा की। समय बीतता गया और यमराज का वो मुख्य वरदान भी भलीभूत हुआ। सावित्री और सत्यवान के आंगन में एक के बाद एक 100 तेजस्वी पुत्रों ने जन्म लिया। वे सभी पुत्र सत्यवान की तरह वीर और सावित्री की तरह बुद्धिमान थे। एक दिन जब सत्यवान अपने राजमहल के झरोखे से अपने खेलते हुए पुत्रों को देख रहे थे, तो सावित्री का हाथ थाम कर उन्होंने कहा, हे सावित्री, आज जो कुछ भी हमारे पास है, ये राज्य, मेरे पिता की आंखों की ज्योति, हमारे ये 100 पुत्र और मेरा ये जीवन, ये सब तुम्हारी दृढ़ इच्छा शक्ति का ही परिणाम है। यदि उस दिन तुम यमराज के पीछे ना जाती तो आज मैं केवल एक राख का ढेर होता। सावित्री ने उत्तर दिया, हे सत्यवान, ये मेरा चमत्कार नहीं बल्कि पतिव्रत धर्म और सत्य की शक्ति है। जब मनुष्य निस्वार्थ प्रेम और धर्म के मार्ग पर चलता है तो स्वयं काल को भी उसके सामने झुकना पड़ता है। मैंने केवल एक पत्नी का कर्तव्य निभाया है। जैसे जैसे वर्ष बीतते गए, सावित्री और सत्यवान का यश पूरी पृथ्वी पर फैल गया। ऋषि मुनियों ने इस कथा को पुराणों में स्थान दिया ताकि आने वाली पीढ़ियां जान सकें कि प्रेम में कितनी शक्ति होती है। सावित्री ने समाज को सिखाया कि संकट के समय बुद्धि को स्थिर रखना चाहिए और कभी भी हार नहीं माननी चाहिए। यमराज ने स्वयं इस कथा के अंत में आकाशवाणी की थी कि जो भी स्त्री जेठ मास की पूर्णिमा को वट सावित्री का व्रत करेगी और इस कथा का श्रवण करेगी, उसके सुहाग पर कभी कोई आंच नहीं आएगी और उसके घर में सुख समृद्धि का वास होगा। आज भी भारत की लाखों स्त्रियां बरगद के वृक्ष की पूजा करती हैं और उस पर सूत का धागा लपेटती हैं। वो बरगद का वृक्ष साक्षी है उस ऐतिहासिक क्षण का जहां सावित्री ने यमराज के पाश से अपने पति सत्यवान के प्राणों को खींच निकाला था। ये धागा केवल सूत का नहीं बल्कि विश्वास और संकल्प का वो अटूट बंधन है जो मृत्यु के पार भी साथ निभाता है। सावित्री और सत्यवान की ये अमर प्रेम कहानी हमें सिखाती है कि यदि हृदय में सच्चाई हो और वाणी में ज्ञान, तो विधाता के लिखे लेख को भी बदला जा सकता है। यही वो रहस्य है जो आज के समय में भी प्रासंगिक है। सावित्री ने यमराज से जो मांगा वो केवल अपने लिए नहीं बल्कि सबके कल्याण के लिए था। इसीलिए सावित्री को आज भी एक देवी के रूप में पूजा जाता है। सावित्री और सत्यवान की ये कथा केवल एक पौराणिक कहानी नहीं बल्कि हर उस व्यक्ति के लिए प्रेरणा है जो विपरीत परिस्थितियों से लड़ रहा है। अंत में सावित्री और सत्यवान 400 वर्षों तक सुखपूर्वक राज करने के बाद सदेह स्वर्ग की ओर प्रस्थान कर गए, जहां आज भी उनके प्रेम की ज्योति नक्षत्रों की तरह चमक रही है।
As the final echoes of tonight's nightmare fade into the darkness, remember that the true horror doesn't end when the video stops. It follows you into the shadows of your own hallway. If you survived this shift at midnight hour US, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss a midnight call. Because out here, the silence is always hiding something. We want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these new jobs would you be desperate enough to take? Or have you already encountered something you can't explain in your own workplace? Lock your doors, turn the volume low, and keep one eye on the mirror until we meet again in the dead of night. This has been Midnight Hour US, where the clock never strikes morning and the stories are just beginning to breathe. Until next time, try to get some sleep if you think you're truly alone.